By this stage in her journey, Noraly was no longer just exploring new places, she was learning how to exist within constant motion. The idea of normal life had quietly faded into the background. There was no fixed schedule, no permanent home, and no predictable routine waiting ahead. Instead, each day began with a simple question: how far can I go today and what will I discover along the way? That question became her structure. It replaced the certainty she once had with something more fluid. Over time, she stopped comparing her life to what it used to be. The road had become her reality, and with that shift came a different kind of clarity, one that could only be understood by living it. There is something deeply transformative about waking up in a new place every morning. The unfamiliar surroundings force the mind to stay alert, to observe, and to adapt quickly. For Noraly, this constant change sharpened her awareness of small details: the way the air felt in different climates, the sounds of early morning in remote villages, the subtle shifts in culture from one region to another. These were not things she had time to notice in her previous life. Now they became essential parts of her experience. The world was no longer something she visited occasionally, it was something she moved through every single day. However, the freedom of this lifestyle came with its own challenges. Without structure, it became easy to feel ungrounded. There were moments when she missed the simplicity of knowing where she would be next week or even the next day. Planning ahead was never guaranteed. Routes could change unexpectedly due to weather, road conditions, or local situations. This unpredictability required constant adjustment. Instead of resisting it, she began to accept it as part of the journey. Flexibility became more valuable than planning, and patience became more important than speed. Long hours on the motorcycle created a unique mental space. With limited distractions, thoughts had room to expand, memories surfaced, ideas developed, and questions that had been ignored in the past demanded attention. It was during these long rides that Noraly often reflected on the decisions that brought her here. She didn't always have clear answers, but the process of thinking itself became meaningful. It helped her understand that growth is not always about finding solutions, it is often about learning how to sit with uncertainty. The physical experience of riding also played a major role in shaping her journey. Unlike traveling in a car, a motorcycle offers no separation from the environment. Every change in temperature, every gust of wind, and every uneven road is felt directly. This constant exposure creates a stronger connection to the surroundings. It also demands focus. A moment of distraction can lead to serious consequences. Over time, this level of awareness becomes second nature. It sharpens reflexes and builds confidence, but it also reminds the rider of their vulnerability. There were days when everything seemed to flow effortlessly. The road would stretch ahead without obstacles, the weather would cooperate, and the scenery would feel almost unreal in its beauty. On those days, riding felt less like effort and more like instinct. It was in these moments that Noraly experienced a sense of freedom that is difficult to describe. It wasn't just about being in a new place, it was about feeling completely present in that place. Those moments became some of the most rewarding parts of her journey. But for every smooth day, there were others that tested her limits. Harsh weather conditions could turn a simple ride into a difficult challenge. Heavy rain reduced visibility, strong winds affected balance, and extreme heat drained energy quickly. These situations required both physical and mental endurance. There was no option to pause everything and wait for perfect conditions. She had to make decisions in real time, constantly assessing risks and adjusting her approach. These experiences built resilience, but they also reminded her that the journey demanded respect. One of the most interesting aspects of traveling alone was how it changed her interactions with people. Being a solo rider made her more approachable. Locals were often curious about her journey and would start conversations out of genuine interest. These interactions were rarely planned, yet they became some of the most memorable moments. A simple question could lead to a meaningful exchange. Even in places where communication was difficult, kindness found its way through gestures and expressions. These human connections added a layer of depth to her travels that no map could provide. They turned unfamiliar places into welcoming environments. Sharing a meal with strangers, receiving help when needed, or simply exchanging smiles created a sense of belonging. It showed her that even in the most remote areas, there is a universal willingness to connect. These experiences reinforced her belief that the world is not as distant or divided as it sometimes seems. As her journey continued, she became more comfortable with uncertainty. What once felt overwhelming gradually became normal. She no longer needed detailed plans to feel secure. Instead, she trusted her ability to adapt. This shift in mindset was one of the most significant changes she experienced. It allowed her to move forward without constantly worrying about what might go wrong. Confidence replaced hesitation, and curiosity replaced fear. At the same time, documenting her journey introduced a new layer of responsibility. Recording daily experiences while traveling required discipline. It was not just about writing, it was also about capturing those moments in a way that others could understand. This meant managing equipment, reviewing footage, and finding time to share her story. Balancing travel and documentation was not always easy, but it became part of her routine. There were moments when things didn't go as planned while filming. Technical issues, poor angles, or missed shots were common. Unlike controlled environments, there was no opportunity to recreate a moment. Once it passed, it was gone. Instead of trying to control everything, she embraced this limitation. It allowed her content to remain authentic. Viewers were seeing real experiences, not carefully constructed scenes. Over time, her audience began to grow. People were drawn to the honesty of her journey. They connected with the realness of her experiences, the challenges, the mistakes, and the small victories. This connection created a sense of community. Her journey was no longer just her own. It became something shared with people from different parts of the world. With that growth came new expectations. Viewers looked forward to updates, followed her progress, and became invested in her story. While this support was encouraging, it also added pressure. Maintaining consistency while traveling long distances required effort. But instead of focusing on expectations, she stayed committed to her original purpose, simply sharing the journey as it happened. The road continued to present new challenges. Mechanical issues were an unavoidable part of long-distance travel. Even a small problem could cause delays. Learning basic repairs became essential. These situations tested patience, but they also built practical skills. Each problem solved added to her confidence. There were also moments when progress slowed down significantly. Border crossings, paperwork, and unexpected delays could interrupt the flow of travel. These pauses were often frustrating, especially when plans had to change, but they also provided time to rest and reflect. In a lifestyle defined by movement, these breaks became important. As time passed, the journey became less about reaching destinations and more about the experience itself. The idea of arriving somewhere lost its importance. What mattered was the process, the daily effort, the small discoveries, and the lessons learned along the way. This shift in perspective changed how she viewed travel. There were still moments of doubt. Even with experience, uncertainty never completely disappeared. Questions about the future, about sustainability, and about purpose occasionally resurfaced. But instead of avoiding these thoughts, she learned to accept them. Doubt became part of the journey, not something that needed to be eliminated. Through all of this, one thing remained constant: her decision to keep going. No matter how difficult a day became, she continued moving forward. That consistency built momentum. It turned small steps into long distances and challenges into achievements. Progress was not always fast, but it was steady. By this point, the journey had already transformed her in ways she could not have predicted. What started as a response to uncertainty had become a way of life. The road had taught her patience, resilience, and independence. But perhaps most importantly, it had shown her that growth often comes from stepping into the unknown and choosing to continue, even when the outcome is unclear. As the journey continued, the sense of forward momentum remained strong, but beneath that movement, a quiet fatigue had begun to build. It wasn't something that appeared suddenly or dramatically. Instead, it developed gradually over time, hidden beneath the routine of writing, filming, and constantly adapting. From the outside, everything still looked steady. The road stretched endlessly ahead, the landscapes continued to change, and the journey appeared as inspiring as ever. But internally, the demands of this lifestyle were beginning to take their toll. Living on the road required energy not just physically, but mentally and emotionally as well too. There is a difference between short-term travel and long-term movement. In short trips, challenges feel temporary. There is always an endpoint in sight, a return to comfort waiting somewhere ahead. But in Noraly's case, the road had no fixed end. It was not a break from life, it was life itself. That reality made every challenge more significant. There was no pause button to step away and recover completely. Every day required her to keep going, even when energy levels dropped or motivation faded. This constant demand slowly created a sense of exhaustion that was difficult to recognize at first. The physical strain of riding for extended periods began to accumulate in subtle ways. Long hours in the saddle, exposure to changing climates, and the need to remain alert at all times started to impact her body. Fatigue doesn't always announce itself clearly. Sometimes it shows up as slower reactions, reduced focus, or a general feeling of heaviness that lingers throughout the day. These small signs are easy to overlook, especially when there is a strong desire to continue. For Noraly, pushing forward had become a habit, and slowing down was not something she often allowed herself to consider. At the same time, the emotional side of the journey continued to evolve. Traveling alone for long periods creates a unique internal dialogue. Without constant interaction, thoughts can become more intense. There are moments of clarity, but also moments where doubts feel louder. Questions about direction, purpose, and sustainability begin to surface more frequently. These thoughts are not necessarily negative, but they require attention. Ignoring them is not always possible. Over time, they become part of the journey just as much as the physical distance traveled. 5. Despite these challenges, the outward appearance of the journey remained inspiring. The landscapes were still breathtaking, the encounters with people continued to be meaningful, and the sense of exploration was still very much alive. Viewers saw the beauty, the freedom, and the courage it took to keep going. What they didn't always see was the effort required to maintain that momentum. The early mornings, the long days, and the constant need to stay focused were all part of the reality behind the scenes. 6. As her route took her into more demanding regions, the difficulty of the journey increased. The terrain became rougher, the distances between safe stops grew longer, and the margin for error became smaller. These conditions required even more attention and preparation. Riding was no longer just about enjoying the road, it was about managing risk carefully. Every decision carried weight, from choosing the right path to managing fuel and supplies. The environment demanded respect, and there was little room for complacency. 7. In these more remote areas, the sense of isolation became stronger. There were stretches of road where help would not be immediately available if something went wrong. This reality added pressure to every ride. It required careful planning and constant awareness. At the same time, it also reinforced her independence. Knowing that she could navigate these conditions on her own built confidence, but it also came with responsibility. Every action mattered. 8. There were still moments of connection along the way. Even in remote regions, people continued to show kindness and curiosity. These interactions provided relief from the intensity of the journey. They reminded her that even in isolation, she was never completely alone. A simple conversation or gesture of help could shift the entire mood of a day. These moments became emotional anchors, grounding her in an experience that was otherwise constantly changing. 9. However, as the journey pushed further into challenging environments, the balance between adventure and risk became more noticeable. What once felt exciting now required more caution. The margin for mistakes had become smaller. Experience helped, but it did not eliminate risk. Every rider, no matter how skilled, remains vulnerable to unexpected situations. This understanding stayed with her even on days when everything seemed under control. 10. Then came a moment that changed the pace of everything. It wasn't planned, and it didn't build up slowly. Like many accidents, it happened suddenly. One moment she was moving forward as she had done countless times before, and the next, everything stopped. The impact was immediate, both physically and mentally. Pain replaced motion, and the journey that had felt continuous was interrupted in an instant. 11. In situations like this, the reality of vulnerability becomes impossible to ignore. The independence that once felt empowering now had to coexist with the need for help. Being in a remote environment made the situation even more complex. Access to proper medical care was not immediate, and decisions had to be made quickly. The focus shifted from continuing the journey to ensuring recovery. 12. The injury itself was serious enough to require professional treatment. What had once been a journey defined by movement now required stillness. Returning home became necessary, even though it meant leaving behind the road that had become so familiar. This transition was not just physical, it was emotional. Stepping away from the journey felt like losing a part of herself, even if it was temporary. 13. Recovery introduced a completely different kind of challenge. Unlike the road, where progress could be measured in distance, healing required patience without visible milestones. Days felt slower, and progress was not always easy to recognize. For someone used to constant movement, this shift was difficult. It required a different mindset, one focused on rest, care, and gradual improvement. 14. Complications during recovery made the situation even more challenging. What initially seemed like a straightforward injury became more serious. This added uncertainty to an already difficult situation. The focus was no longer just on healing quickly, but on healing properly. Rushing the process was no longer an option. The body needed time, and that time could not be shortened through determination alone. 15. During this period, the absence of the road became more noticeable. The routine of riding, the constant change of scenery, and the sense of forward movement were all suddenly missing. This created a sense of emptiness that was difficult to ignore. It wasn't just about travel, it was about identity. The journey had become such a central part of her life that stepping away from it felt unfamiliar. 16. However, within that stillness, something else began to develop. Without the distraction of constant movement, there was time to reflect more deeply. Experiences that had once passed quickly now had space to be understood. Memories resurfaced with greater clarity. The journey could now be seen not just as a series of events, but as a continuous transformation. 17. This period of reflection brought a new level of awareness. It highlighted not only the challenges she had faced, but also the strength she had built along the way. The ability to adapt, to continue, and to face uncertainty had not disappeared, it was still there, just expressed differently. Instead of moving forward physically, she was now moving forward internally. 18. Gradually, the idea of returning to the road began to take shape again. It was no longer driven by urgency but by intention. The journey would continue, but with a deeper understanding of its demands. The pause had changed her perspective. It showed her that progress is not only about moving forward, it is also about knowing when to stop and recover. This shift in mindset marked an important turning point. The journey was no longer just about distance or exploration. It had become something more personal and more balanced. The experience of stopping had added a new dimension to her story. It showed that strength is not only found in pushing forward but also in accepting limits. By the end of this phase, one thing was clear. The journey had not ended, it had evolved. The challenges she faced had not weakened her connection to the road. Instead, they had deepened it. What lay ahead was not just a continuation, but a new chapter shaped by everything she had learned so far.